What if one single photo could shatter a millionaire's control, because it proved the woman he ignored could be wanted by someone else? For 8 years, Claire kept Dan Thornton's empire running like clockwork, while he walked past her desk like she was part of the furniture. No, how are you? No, are you okay? Just deadlines, demands, and silence. Then one Saturday night, Claire steps into a burgundy dress and another man's arm rests at her waist like it belongs there. She laughs. She glows. She looks alive. And Dan sees it on his phone. Not in a meeting, not on a report, in a photo where she's finally seen. Jealousy hits him like fear. But the real question is, when a woman stops being invisible, is it already too late for the man who never looked up? Stay with me, let's step into Claire's story. The city was still wrapped in a cold blue darkness when Claire Winslow stepped out of her car and shut the door gently behind her. The downtown streets of Denver were quiet. The kind of quiet that belonged only to the earliest hour before sunrise, when even the mountains in the distance felt half asleep. Claire pulled her gray cardigan tighter around her shoulders, breathing out a thin cloud of warm air before heading toward the glass tower she'd entered almost every weekday for the past 8 years. Inside, the elevator hummed softly as it carried her upward. She watched the dim reflection of herself in the metal doors, hair pulled back loosely, no makeup work bag, hugged against her side like a familiar companion. She didn't love how tired she looked, but she didn't hate it either. It was simply her face now, the face of someone who kept everything running so other people didn't have to think about how things worked. The elevator doors opened to the empty 22nd floor. The office lights were motion-sensitive, flickering awake one row at a time as Claire walked through. The click of her sensible heels echoed across the wide hallway, then softened as she reached the carpet. She moved through the space without thinking, guided by a rhythm her body had learned long ago. Coffee first always. She pushed the stainless steel carafe into place and listened to the familiar drip as it filled. Then to the thermostat. She raised it 2 degrees because she knew the design team complained when it was too cold. She turned on the small lamps in the conference rooms, the ones that made the office feel less like a factory and more like a place where people created things that mattered. On Dan Thornton's desk, large walnut immaculate, she placed the day's schedule, printed and clipped neatly. 3 meetings before noon, a call with Chicago, a working lunch. She straightened the blue pen he preferred, placing it exactly parallel to the edge of his notebook. By the time she opened her laptop and began responding to the avalanche of emails that always arrived overnight, the sky outside had shifted from navy to a washed-out gray. The building grew louder, elevator chimes, voices, doors opening, the hum of printers. At exactly 7:58 a.m., the front doors swung open. Dan Thornton didn't walk so much as he moved through space with purpose. Tall, well-dressed, wearing a navy coat, he hadn't zipped, even though the air still carried the bite of winter. His watch caught the morning light as he strode past Claire's desk. "Morning," he said. Not unkind. Not warm. Just automatic. Claire managed a small nod, even though he was already halfway to his office. He placed his coat over the same chair he always placed it on. She would move it to the coat rack in 2 minutes, the way she did every day. She watched him for just a second. Not longing, that wasn't the word. More like studying someone she'd learned to read through tiny cues. The faster stride meant he was bracing for bad news from Chicago. The sharper tone on his "thank you" later would confirm it. Claire wasn't proud of how well she understood his moods. It was simply part of the job, and if she was honest, it gave her structure, something steady in a life that had lost its steadiness long ago. At 1015, a young employee from accounting stopped by her desk with a shy smile. "Claire, I just wanted to say thanks again for remembering about my daughter's surgery. She loved the little stuffed fox you sent. Really made her week." Claire smiled, warm but modest. "I'm glad she liked it. How is she feeling today?" "Much better." He nodded gratefully and walked off. Almost immediately, Dan appeared behind him, stepping into Claire's space with a stack of papers. "Can you revise this financial summary?" he asked. "I need it before 11. He didn't seem to notice the accounting employee standing there. He didn't seem to notice anything really except the work in his hands. "Of course," Claire said. He was already gone. Moments like that didn't hurt anymore. Not in the sharp way they used to. They simply landed quietly like snow on a windowsill. She wasn't invisible because people meant to overlook her. She was invisible because she had built her life around making sure nothing ever revolved around her. Years ago, before the divorce, before her father's health declined, before the bills and the empty house and the late-night panic she kept hidden, she had once imagined a life painted in broader strokes. She used to want color, noise, scenes that didn't begin and end with a screen full of unread emails. She used to paint. The memory surfaced gently uninvited as she opened her phone during a rare quiet moment. She wasn't sure why she navigated to the old photo gallery she rarely touched. Maybe because the accounting employee's gratitude had hit a small tender place inside her. Maybe because the gray cardigan she wore every day felt suddenly heavier than usual. Her thumb slid across the screen and there it was. A much younger Claire, hair curling in the summer heat, paint smudged across her jeans and forearm. She stood in front of a half-finished mural, a swirl of reds and golds and sky blues. She looked alive, a little messy but bright, uncontained. Claire stared at the photo longer than she intended. It felt like looking at a stranger she once knew. Someone who had plans and edges, someone who wasn't shaped entirely by obligation. A sigh escaped her before she could stop it. In 8 years at Thornton Logistics, no one had ever asked Claire if she was happy. And somehow she realized she had stopped asking herself the same question. As the coffee machine sputtered in the background and the hum of office chatter grew louder, Claire slipped her phone back into her bag, but the image of the mural clung to her mind, refusing to fade. Something inside her shifted just slightly. Not enough to create change, not yet, but enough to remind her that change was possible. And possibility, even the smallest flicker of it, can be the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. The staff kitchen was never truly quiet at noon, but on that Thursday the hum of the microwave and the low chatter from a distant hallway seemed to fade behind Claire's focus. She sat at the small round table near the window, eating a simple salad from a plastic container, while her thumbs moved quickly across her phone screen. Emails, approvals, a contractor needing signatures, another delay on a shipment to Kansas. She swallowed without tasting anything. It was only when someone dropped into the chair across from her with the energy of a person on a mission that Claire finally looked up. Megan Hart, marketing manager, hair in a loose ponytail that somehow still looked stylish, eyes bright with mischief or determination, usually both. "Oh good," Megan said, tapping her coffee cup on the table. "You're not hiding today." Claire raised an eyebrow. "I don't hide." "You absolutely hide," Megan said. "You blend into corners like a beige throw pillow." Despite herself, Claire let out a small breath of amusement. "I'm eating lunch." And answering emails, Megan added, pointing at the phone still in Claire's hand. "Which is not lunch. That's just working while chewing." Claire set the phone down reluctantly. "All right, Megan. What's going on?" Megan leaned forward with dramatic seriousness. "I'm here to save your life." "Oh Lord," Claire murmured. "Not this again." "Yes, this again," Megan insisted. "Because I refuse to let you turn into one of those people who retire and then don't know what to do with themselves except alphabetize spices." Claire picked at a tomato slice. "I like order." "You need fun," Megan countered. There was a beat of silence, and then Megan produced a glossy postcard from her bag, sliding it across the table like she was offering a winning lottery ticket. Art and Light, Claire read softly. "Fundraiser at the Riverside Arts Center. Live jazz, small auction, wine tasting." And Megan added an excuse to leave your house on a Saturday night. Claire felt her shoulders tense automatically. "Meg, I don't think." "No," Megan interrupted already, shaking her head. "I know that tone. That's the I'll be too tired tone. Next comes, it's not my scene, followed by I have nothing to wear. I have heard all of these for the past 3 years. Claire lifted her hands in a helpless gesture. "They're legitimate reasons." Megan snorted. "They're excuses wrapped in adult responsibilities. Which, by the way, you use like armor." Claire looked away toward the window, where the winter sun reflected faintly off the snowy rooftops of Denver. She didn't want to admit Megan was right. She really didn't. "I don't know, Meg," she said quietly. "It feels strange. I haven't gone to anything like this in ages." "And whose fault is that?" Megan countered gently but firmly. "You used to love art." You used to paint Claire. You used to drag me into galleries on Saturdays and talk about colors like they were living things. That was a long time ago. Not that long, Megan said softly. Just before life got hard. Claire swallowed the salad, suddenly dry in her throat. She hated when Megan did this, seeing through her with uncomfortable accuracy. It's just one evening, Megan continued, brightening her tone, as if sensing Claire was close to shutting down. A few hours. You'll listen to music, sip some wine, maybe bid on something you don't actually want. And there will be people there who don't know you as the woman who keeps Dan Thornton's world spinning. You might like that. Claire fiddled with the lid of her lunch container. I wouldn't know what to wear. Black dress, Megan said instantly, or the navy one. Or literally anything that isn't gray. Claire sighed. I don't know if I can. Megan leaned forward, lowering her voice. Claire, when was the last time someone saw you as more than helpful? The question landed like a quiet blow. Not cruel, just painfully true. Claire blinked. I'm not sure. I am, Megan said. It's been too long. Silence filled the small kitchen. Someone outside laughed loudly. A microwave beeped. A kettle clicked off. But inside Claire, something soft shifted like the faint creaking of an old door that hadn't been opened in years. She thought about the photo she'd seen earlier that morning, the mural, the girl she used to be. The one with paint on her hands and laughter in her chest. She wondered for the first time in a long time what had happened to her. Maybe just once. She could say yes to something that wasn't work. But immediately, the familiar resistance rose up. What if she felt awkward? What if she didn't fit in? What if she looked foolish? Megan must have seen the hesitation in her eyes because she straightened and pointed her coffee cup like a wand. If you say no, she warned dramatically, I'm showing up at your house on Saturday with a dress heels and maybe a kidnapping plan. Don't test me. Claire let out a genuine laugh, small but real. It surprised her. Fine, she said, raising her hands in surrender. I'll come, but if I hate it, I'm leaving after 1 hour. Megan's grin could have powered the break room lights. Deal. And trust me, you won't hate it. Claire wasn't so sure. But as Megan launched into excited plans about hair and shoes, and what time she'd pick her up, Claire felt an unfamiliar warmth slip into her chest. Not quite joy. Not quite fear. Something between them. Something like a beginning. Saturday arrived with a thin veil of clouds drifting across the Colorado sky, softening the afternoon light in a way that made the whole world seem gentler than usual. Claire stood in the center of her small townhouse bedroom, hands on her hips, staring at the open closet with a growing sense of dread. Rows of clothes hung neatly in front of her gray navy beige. Work slacks, work blouses. Every shade of quiet. She pulled out a navy dress she'd worn to a company dinner last year. Conservative neckline. Straight cut. Nothing wrong with it, nothing memorable either. She held it up against her body, sighed and tossed it onto the bed. Next came a gray wrap dress. Too plain. Then a black one. Too funeral. She tried on a soft blue top, then changed out of it immediately. Everything felt like office Claire, the version of herself she wore like a uniform. The version that blended in, lit no shadows, caused no ripples. This is ridiculous, she muttered, tugging another blouse over her head. It's just a fundraiser, not a. She caught sight of herself in the mirror mid-sentence. Hair flattened from pulling clothes on and off. Cheeks flushed in frustration. Eyes tired. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't noticed in a long time. A trace of longing. A faint spark of the woman she once allowed herself to be. She exhaled slowly, then turned back to the closet. There was a small box on the top shelf she hadn't touched in years. She dragged a chair over, climbed up carefully, and pulled it down. Inside were pieces of her past, a few old sketchbooks, a dried paintbrush, photographs she could barely remember taking. And nestled beneath them, a dress. Burgundy. Simple, elegant, a soft fabric that felt warm and familiar in her hands. She remembered it instantly. She'd worn it in her early 30s to a friend's backyard wedding. Warm string lights, overhead music drifting through June, air laughter she hadn't learned to quiet yet, back when she believed life was still unfolding instead of narrowing. She held the dress up to the light. It still had shape, still had color, and strangely still felt like hers. Before fear could talk her out of it, she slipped it on. The fabric skimmed her waist in a way that surprised her gentle flattering. The V-neck wasn't too deep, just enough to feel feminine without drawing unwanted attention. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the woman in burgundy looking back at her. She wasn't 25 anymore. She wasn't carefree. But she wasn't gone, either. Her hands trembled a little as she reached for the small gold earrings she hadn't worn since her divorce. Then she let her hair down, brushing through the soft waves that fell just past her shoulders. A touch of mascara, a hint of rose on her lips. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind herself she still had a face worth noticing. She leaned closer to the mirror. The voice that usually whispered she was too old, too tired, too late, grew faint like a radio losing signal. For the first time in years, Claire felt almost visible. A sudden honk from outside startled her. "Megan!" "Claire," her friend shouted from the walkway. "Your fairy godmother has arrived, and I brought breath mints." Claire laughed, a real startled laugh, and grabbed her clutch before heading downstairs. When she opened the door, Megan froze. "Oh, my God!" Claire flushed. "Is that good?" "Good." Megan blinked, then pointed at her dramatically. "Claire Winslow, if you don't let me take a picture of you right now, I'm calling the authorities." "Absolutely not." "Fine," Megan grinned, looping her arm through Claire's. "I'll settle for staring at you until you get in the car." The sky had grown darker by the time they pulled out of Claire's neighborhood, heading toward downtown. Streetlights flickered on, one by one. Dusk wrapped the city in hazy gold, while snow glimmered faintly along the foothills far beyond the buildings. Traffic moved slowly as they crossed Spear Boulevard, the long shadow of the mountains pressing softly against the skyline. Megan talked excitedly about the gallery, the artists, the people who would be attending. Her words flowed like quick water, but Claire only caught pieces of them. Her mind drifted to the mural she once painted to the girl in that old photograph, to the feeling of the burgundy dress against her skin. She placed a hand lightly over her stomach, surprised by the flutter there. Nervousness, anticipation, maybe a little fear, but they felt alive, not heavy. When they finally parked outside the Riverside Arts Center, warm light spilled from the windows, painting the sidewalk in amber tones. People in winter coats and scarves clustered near the entrance, their voices soft and cheerful in the crisp air. Claire hesitated as they approached the door. "Hey, Megan," said gently, touching her arm. "Just breathe. You look beautiful. And you're allowed to enjoy tonight, okay?" Claire nodded, absorbing the reassurance. She wasn't sure she believed it yet, but she let the words settle into her heart. Then she stepped inside. The air was warm, filled with the soft hum of conversation and distant jazz music drifting from a trio in the corner. String lights hung along the ceiling beams, casting a glow that made everything feel cozy and intimate. And that was when it happened. A man near the entryway, mid-40s tall, with kind eyes, glanced up as Claire and Megan walked in. His eyes paused on Claire, widening slightly, not in a predatory way, but in a surprised, appreciative, respectful way. As if he hadn't expected to see someone like her walking through those doors. As if she were worth a second look. Claire's breath caught, just for a moment, but long enough for her heart to flutter, unsteady but alive. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know if she would ever speak to him. All she knew was that something in her shifted, quiet but unmistakable. For the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. The jazz trio had just begun a slow, velvet-smooth number when Claire and Megan stepped deeper into the art center. The space glowed with amber light, reflecting off wine glasses and polished wooden floors. Voices mingled softly, rising and falling like gentle waves as people drifted from painting to painting. Claire felt the warmth of the room slip over her shoulders like a shawl. She wasn't used to events like this anymore. She wasn't sure she belonged in a place filled with color, laughter, and sparkling eyes. But something inside her, something she thought had long fallen asleep, stirred awake. Megan scanned the room, searching for familiar faces. "Let's start on the left," she whispered, already steering Claire toward a row of landscape paintings bathed in golden spotlights. But just as they approached the first canvas, a mountain ridge drawn in deep blues and fiery red streaks, a friendly voice chimed in beside them. Beautiful, isn't it? Both women turned. A man stood there tall and slightly broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal blazer and an unassuming smile. His dark blonde hair had a hint of silver at the temples, the kind that made him look both youthful and wise. He held a volunteer's badge clipped to his lapel. "Hi," he said, offering a hand first to Megan, then to Claire. "I'm Mark. Mark Caldwell." "Volunteer?" Megan asked, pointing at the badge. "Guilty." He smiled. "I help out with the student programs here. I teach art at a high school up in Boulder." Claire blinked. "You're an art teacher?" "Mm-hmm." He nodded toward the painting. "Actually, one of my former students did this piece. I'm here tonight mostly to brag." His laugh was warm, genuine, like something that came straight from the chest, not the throat. Megan grinned. "Well, we'll let you brag all you want. I'm Megan, and this is Claire." When Mark shifted his attention to Claire, she felt the air around them settle. He didn't look at her dress first. He didn't glance at her hair. He didn't scan her like she was someone to evaluate. He looked at her eyes as if she were a person worth meeting. "What do you think of the piece?" he asked gently. Claire hesitated. She hadn't talked about art in years, not out loud. But something about him, maybe the openness in his tone, made her want to try. "I love the horizon line," she said softly. "It feels brave, like the mountains are stretching toward tomorrow." Mark's eyebrows lifted, impressed. "That's a beautiful interpretation." Her cheeks warmed. "I just used to paint a bit. A long time ago." "Once a painter, always a painter," he said. "It never really leaves you." They moved slowly along the wall, from painting to painting. Megan drifted away to greet someone she recognized, leaving Claire and Mark walking side by side. He didn't ask where she worked. He didn't ask what she earned. He just asked, "What kind of art did you make?" "Landscapes," she said, surprised at how easily the word left her. "Mostly. I loved capturing light." Mark's eyes sparkled. "Me too. I still shoot film photos sometimes. My old record player and camera collection probably dates me more than my students would like to admit." A soft laugh escaped her. "I still have a record player at home." "No way," he said. "Vinyl lovers are a disappearing species. I'm honored to meet another." It felt natural, shockingly natural, to talk with him. Claire felt rusty, at first, like opening a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. But slowly, as Mark shared stories about teaching teenagers to blend watercolors or getting paint in his coffee more often than he'd like, she found herself relaxing. Her smile came easier, her shoulders lowered. She even really laughed when he described the chaos of an open studio day at school. At some point, Megan swooped back into the scene with a mischievous grin. "Photo time," she declared. "Oh no," Claire murmured. "Oh yes," Megan insisted, already pulling out her phone. "Come on, just one." "You both look way too charming not to document." Mark chuckled. "Guess we've been drafted." The first picture was of the three of them, with Megan insisting everyone look less stiff. Then she wanted just one of Claire and Mark. As they posed, Mark's hand slipped naturally gently to the small of Claire's back. Not possessive, not flirtatious, just present. A simple gesture of connection. Her breath hitched, but she didn't step away. The camera clicked. Claire laughed softly, a surprised, genuine sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. It wasn't a spark or a jolt, just warmth. Warmth where his hand rested. Warmth where her laughter rose. Warmth in the thought that maybe she wasn't as invisible as she'd believed. The evening carried on, full of color and music and soft approving smiles, exchanged between Claire and this kind steady man who somehow felt familiar after only an hour. It wasn't love. It wasn't even a crush, but it was something. And something was more than she'd had in a very long time. Later that night, after she'd returned home, taken off her shoes, and slipped into the quiet stillness of her living room, her phone buzzed. A notification. "Megan Hart tagged you in a photo." Claire opened the picture. There she was, standing in that burgundy dress, hair softly curled, eyes bright. And beside her, Mark's hand at her back, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame. The caption read, "Look who finally let herself have a Saturday night." Mark was tagged. People had already begun liking the photo. Claire felt her face warm, not with embarrassment but with something gentler, something she had trouble naming. She stared at the image a long time, tracing the outline of the woman she saw there. A woman she almost didn't recognize. A woman who looked like she was ready for what-ifs. Just then, her phone buzzed again. A message. From Mark. She inhaled sharply before opening it. And the night, quiet, tender, full of possibility, suddenly felt like it was only beginning. Monday mornings at Thornton Logistics always smelled like fresh coffee and urgency, but that day something else floated quietly in the air. Something Dan Thornton couldn't identify. Claire walked in at 6:57 a.m. Right on schedule, setting her bag neatly by her desk. Before starting the morning routine she carried out with the precision of a heartbeat. Coffee brewed, agendas printed. The thermostat nudged up exactly 1 degree because she knew the sales team always complained about the cold on Mondays. But there was something different. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Just lighter. A softer curve in her smile when she greeted security. A faint humming under her breath as she sorted through a stack of contracts. The way she moved with a quiet looseness, as if some hidden weight had shifted off her shoulders. Dan noticed it from inside his glass-walled office. He noticed it without trying. And that irritated him. He had too many things to focus on: a delayed shipment from Portland, a quarterly review with the board, a negotiation call at noon. He didn't have time to be aware of whether Claire Winslow was humming or floating or whatever she was doing that felt different today. But every time he glanced toward the doorway, there she was. And every time that something tugged at him, at 1130, while waiting for a supplier to call him back, Dan sat at his desk tapping a pen against an untouched report. On impulse or boredom, he unlocked his phone. He rarely scrolled social media. He barely had time to sleep. But a notification had appeared, suggested connections, probably employees, or vendors, or people he'd never add. He scrolled lazily with his thumb. Megan Hart. He recognized her face, the marketing manager who always had some bright idea and talked too fast in meetings. He was about to keep scrolling past her profile picture when something caught his eye. A post, a group photo. Warm lighting. People dressed up, and Claire. His thumb froze mid-scroll. He tapped the image without thinking. There she was, standing in a burgundy dress that hugged her gently, her hair down in soft waves, her smile wide and open in a way he did not recognize. Not the polite, professional, subdued office smile. Not the small, careful gestures he saw from her every day. This was different. She looked younger, brighter, alive. But that wasn't the part that punched the air out of his lungs. A man stood beside her. His arm rested lightly around her waist, casual, easy, natural. Claire didn't seem uncomfortable. In fact, she leaned slightly toward him as they laughed at something beyond the frame. Something hot and electric shot through Dan's chest. Sharp, immediate, completely irrational. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He zoomed in slightly, his jaw clenched. Who the hell was this man? Why was his hand on Claire? Why did she look so happy standing next to him? His neck grew warm. His grip tightened around the phone. He felt an emotion he hadn't experienced since his 20s, raw and unwelcome. Not the petty, superficial kind. This was deeper. A surge that made his stomach twist and his heart pound far harder than it should. He forced his eyes back to the photo, studying the details with something close to desperation. The burgundy dress, the easy laugh, the way her eyes crinkled slightly, something he had never seen in 4 years of working beside her. God, how had he never seen her look like that? He swallowed hard. Why do I care? She's my employee, my assistant, a cog in the machine that keeps my schedule functioning. That was what he told himself. But the words felt thin, transparent, false. He remembered that morning how she'd hummed softly while organizing his files, how there'd been a warmth around her he couldn't name, and now he knew why. She had a life outside these walls. A life that did not revolve around him. A life that included him. The man in the photo. Dan leaned back in his chair, breath shaky, heart beating faster than it had during any board negotiation. He felt disoriented, as though the ground beneath him had shifted just a few inches, but enough to throw him off balance. What else had he not seen? All those years she'd arrived before dawn. All the quiet work she did to hold his world together. All the times she'd answered him before he finished his sentences. He'd never once wondered who she'd be went home to, or if she went home to anyone at all. He had never asked if she was lonely, if she was tired, if she was happy, and here she was smiling in a way that made him feel like he'd been asleep for years. Something inside him tightened painfully, something he didn't want to name. A sharp knock hit his door. Mr. Thornton, his operations director, poked her head in. The team is ready. The meeting started 5 minutes ago. Dan blinked. He had missed the beginning of a meeting. He, the man who never missed a second of anything, was sitting frozen at his desk, staring at a photograph of a woman who was not his. He cleared his throat, pushing the phone face down on his desk. "I'll be right there." But even as he straightened his jacket and forced his expression into its usual unreadable mask, he felt the truth simmer under his ribs. He wasn't angry at Claire. He wasn't angry at the man. He was angry at himself. For never seeing her. For never noticing the quiet beauty, the steady grace. For only realizing what she meant to him now, when someone else had. And as he walked to the conference room, trying to gather himself, the image of Claire's smile, bright, free, belonged to no one, stayed with him. Unshakable, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. The next morning, Dan noticed the coffee. It was the same blend Claire always ordered for the office, the same stainless steel carafe, the same white mug on his desk at exactly 7:59 But when he picked it up and took a sip, the warmth felt different. Or maybe he did. From that day on, it was as if someone had quietly adjusted the focus on his life. Where there had once been a blur of motion and tasks and numbers, he suddenly saw details he'd never taken in before. He saw Claire, not just as a reliable shape behind a desk, not just as a voice that smoothed over his rough edges with clients, but as a constant presence woven into every part of his day. He saw the way she anticipated his needs so well that he rarely had to finish a sentence. "Can you pull the 'it's already in your inbox'?" she'd reply without looking up, fingers flying across the keyboard. He saw the extra hours she stayed when no one asked her to. The last one in the pool of cubicles after everyone else had gone home. The soft glow from her monitor casting a halo around her face. He saw the care in her voice when she spoke to stressed clients, the way she didn't just relay information but listened. "No, I understand this shipment is critical for you," she'd say. "Let me see what we can move around. I'll call you back within the hour, I promise." He watched as tension on the other end of the line gradually eased, as if they somehow felt steadier just because she was the one talking. It bothered him how much he'd missed. He caught himself watching her at the copier one afternoon. She was clearing a jam, hands, steady brow furrowed in concentration. A strand of hair had escaped her, clip brushing against her cheek. She blew it away absently, that familiar small crease forming at the bridge of her nose. Had she always done that? How many times had he walked right past it? He watched her in meetings, too. Before, she'd just been the person who handed out agendas, took notes, kept everyone on track. But now he noticed the way her eyes flickered when someone missed an obvious point, the way she pressed her lips together when she had a thought but didn't speak. He began to wonder what he'd hear if he asked. The opportunity came 3 days after he'd seen the photo. They were preparing for a call with a major client out of Dallas, a client who'd hinted they might switch to a competitor. Dan stood at Claire's desk holding a file. For the first time in a long while, he hesitated before speaking. "Claire," he said slowly, "can I get your perspective on something?" She looked up surprised. "On what? This account?" He tapped the folder. "We've had them for 6 years. They're talking to other providers. I have my theories why, but I'm curious what you see." Curious. The word tasted strange in his mouth, but right. Claire blinked, clearly taken aback. He'd asked her to organize calls, to move meetings, to send reports, but never this. "Are you sure?" she asked. He almost winced. "Yes, I'm sure." She gestured to the chair in front of her desk. He sat, an unfamiliar shift in the balance between them. Claire opened the file, scanning through notes, emails, contract changes. Her eyes moved quickly, absorbing patterns. She was quiet for a moment, then another. Dan waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence. Finally, she spoke. "I think they feel taken for granted," she said. He frowned. "Taken for granted how they're big," Claire said calmly. "Stable. They don't complain much, they pay on time. So, when smaller clients made more noise, we gave them more attention. We gave the Dallas team mostly automated updates, scheduled calls farther apart. They became the safe account, the one we assumed would stay." Dan leaned back slowly. It stung because it was true. And he asked. And Claire continued, "Their competitors are courting them, sending people on site. Listening. Making them feel like they matter again. If we want to keep them, we need to do more than fix this one issue. We need to show up. In person. On their turf." Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't dramatic, just clear. It was a better analysis than he'd heard from half his leadership team. Dan swallowed. "Why haven't you said anything before?" She gave him a look that was almost amused, almost sad. "You never asked." There it was again, that small, quiet indictment. Not delivered to wound, but impossible to ignore. He nodded slowly, feeling something tight coil in his chest. "Okay," he said. "Book us flights to Dallas for next week. You're coming with me." Claire's eyes widened. "Me, you thought of the strategy," he said. "You should be in the room when we deliver it." She didn't answer immediately. He could see her, weighing the sudden shift. For years she'd been the person behind the curtain. Now he was pulling her into the spotlight. "All right," she said finally. "If you're sure." "I am," he said, and for once he meant it about something bigger than a business decision. From then on he tried to listen differently. He started saying, "Thank you, Claire," instead of the vague rushed thanks he'd tossed over his shoulder for years. The first time he did it, she glanced up with a questioning tilt of her head, as if trying to decide whether she'd heard right. He noticed that too. He noticed the way her shoulders eased the tiniest bit when he gave her context for last-minute changes, instead of just dropping extra work on her desk. He saw how she sat a little straighter when he introduced her by name to a client, instead of just "my assistant." Sometimes, late at night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights, wondering how many other people he'd failed to see. Wondering what kind of man it made him that it took a photo of a stranger's arm around Claire's waist to wake him up. One evening, the office had thinned out. The sky outside had darkened to deep indigo, the lights of Denver glittering against it like scattered coins. Claire was at her desk, shutting down her computer, slipping papers into a neat stack. She reached for her bag. On impulse, Dan stepped out of his office and crossed the floor. "Claire," she paused, turning toward him. "Yes." He stopped a few feet from her desk, suddenly aware that this was new ground. Not, "Can you move this meeting?" or, "Did you send that email?" Just, her. He cleared his throat. "Did you have a good weekend?" For a second, the question hung between them, fragile and strange. She blinked. "My weekend, yes." His voice was softer than he'd intended. "I realized I've never asked." She studied him, searching his face as if looking for the catch. When she didn't find one, something in her expression softened. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did. It was nice." A small, cautious smile touched her mouth like a door opening, just a crack. "That's good," he replied. And he meant it. As she walked toward the elevator, coat over her arm, he watched her go with a mix of regret and resolve. He couldn't change the years he'd spent looking past her, but maybe, just maybe, he could start now. By Wednesday morning, Claire began to notice the shift. It started small, almost imperceptibly small, the kind of thing she could have ignored if she hadn't been paying attention. But she was. She'd learned to watch for changes, to prepare for them, to protect herself from the sharp edges of hope. Dan arrived earlier than usual that day. She heard the elevator chime at 7:42, the brisk steps approaching. She braced for the usual, his coat tossed on the chair, his distracted morning, the list of tasks. But instead, he stopped at her desk. He held a cup of coffee, the exact order she preferred: oat milk, 1 pump of vanilla, no foam, a detail she never told him. He must have observed it quietly over the years. "I thought you might like this," he said. His tone wasn't casual. It wasn't flirtatious either, it was careful, as if he'd rehearsed the words on the way there. Claire blinked. "Oh, you handled the Chambers account well yesterday," he added. "I should have said that sooner." She swallowed. A quiet warmth slipped into her chest, but right behind it came another feeling, guarded, wary. Kindness from Dan felt like standing too close to a ledge. She didn't know whether to lean forward or step back. "Just doing my job," she said lightly, but as he walked to his office she stared at the coffee in her hands longer than she meant to. He noticed. After all this time, he noticed. She tried to shake it off, bury herself in emails. Her phone buzzed a few minutes later, a text from Mark. "Mark, hope your morning's kind to you. Saw a painting today that reminded me of that horizon interpretation you mentioned. You have a good eye, Claire." She smiled without meaning to. Mark was steady. Easy. Talking to him felt like exhaling. And yet when Dan walked by her desk a moment later, sleeves rolled, brow furrowed in concentration, her pulse jumped as though her body hadn't checked in with her mind. She hated that. She also couldn't deny it. The rest of the day unfolded in small, strange ripples. Dan asked her opinion twice, once about an upcoming negotiation, once about internal restructuring. He listened too. Not the distracted kind of listening that came with typing or reading an email, but real attention. Focused. Present. It unsettled her, because men didn't usually go from indifferent to attentive without wanting something. And Claire didn't know if she was ready to find out what that something might be. That evening, the office emptied slowly. Footsteps faded down hallways, the glow from monitors winked out one by one. The winter dusk outside deepened into night until the city lights felt like stars fallen to the ground. By 7:15, only 2 lights remained on the entire floor. Claire's and Dan's. They'd been working through a crisis shipment, trucks delayed in Wyoming, a client threatening penalties, logistics snarled. Claire had handled the calls. Dan had managed the negotiations. When they weren't moving, they hovered over the same desk, comparing notes, strategizing. At some point, exhaustion lightened their mood. A comment from Claire, something about Wyoming having exactly 2 weather settings, blizzard and almost blizzard, made Dan laugh in a way she'd never heard from him. Warm, unrestrained, human. She looked up at him, surprised. He was already looking at her. The moment stretched, soft and quiet, not charged like something urgent was about to happen, but heavy with something unspoken, something they both felt without naming. "You're good at this," he said, voice low. "Really good." Claire felt her throat tighten. "I've been doing it a long time." "That's not what I mean." His gaze held hers. "You have instincts people would pay a fortune for." Her breath faltered. "Dan?" He stepped just slightly closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to make the air between them warm. "I should have valued that sooner," he said quietly. "I should have valued you sooner." A flutter of panic and something dangerously like hope swept through her. Her pulse quickened, her mouth went dry. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she wanted to hear more or stop him before he crossed a line they could never uncross. The silence thickened, humming like a wire stretched too tight. She could feel him leaning toward a truth he wasn't supposed to speak. She could feel her heart leaning toward hearing it. "Dan," she whispered, unsure if it was warning or invitation. And then, the office door swung open with a sharp clatter. A cleaning crew stepped in, 2 workers pushing a cart of supplies, chatting softly in Spanish before they froze, realizing the office wasn't empty. "Oh, sorry," one of them said. "Didn't know anyone was still here." The moment shattered, like glass dropped quietly but irreparably. Claire stepped back so quickly she almost bumped into her chair. I should go," she said, grabbing her coat with more force than needed. "It's late." "Claire, no, it's fine. We're all done here. Good night." Her voice sounded thin, breathless. She hated that. Before he could say another word, she slipped past him, heart hammering the echo of something unfinished, chasing her toward the elevator. She didn't look back. Dan stood in the dim light of the office, the hum of the vacuum cleaner, filling the space where their almost confession had been. He closed his eyes for a long second, because he knew and she knew that something had nearly been said. something they weren't ready for, something they both felt and feared. And neither of them knew what would happen when that moment came again. Because it would. The next day unfolded with the muted rhythm of a snowstorm brewing somewhere in the Rockies. The sky hung low and heavy, casting the office in cooler tones than usual. Claire felt the weight of last night in her shoulders, the almost confession, the way the room had held its breath, the way she'd fled. She'd barely slept, replaying every second of that moment, every flicker in Dan's eyes. She walked in that morning determined to keep a clean line between work and whatever that moment had been. She arrived early, set out the agendas, managed emails, organized the day as if nothing had happened. But Dan wasn't quite himself. He was softer and oddly tense. He thanked her twice before noon, and both times he said her name with a care that made her pulse flick in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. Around 5:12 p.m., as the office thinned and the sky outside deepened to a dusky blue, Dan stepped out of his office. "Claire, do you have a moment?" Her heart twitched. She kept her expression neutral. "Sure. What do you need?" He hesitated. That was new. Dan never hesitated. He looked almost nervous as he approached her desk. "I was wondering," he began, then cleared his throat. "If you'd be willing to join me for dinner tonight." Claire blinked. He continued quickly, as if afraid she might misunderstand. "I'd like to thank you properly. For all you do. For the extra hours. For stepping up lately. There's a place on 17th, quiet, good food, nothing formal. My treat, of course." A small ripple went through her, surprise first, then caution. She glanced down at her hands, suddenly aware of how still they were. "Dinner," she repeated softly. "Yes," he said. "Just dinner. A thank you." But the way he looked at her didn't feel like just dinner. And Claire felt her chest tighten. Lines, boundaries. She had worked too hard to keep her footing to blur them now. And yet a part of her, the part that remembered the warmth in his eyes the night before, the almost confession that nearly slipped between them, wanted to say yes. But another part whispered firmly, "You know better, Claire. Don't confuse attention with meaning. Don't confuse longing with possibility." And then she thought of Mark. Mark, who didn't know her in relation to work. Mark, who didn't see her as someone who organized his life, but as someone with her own. Mark, who had texted that morning, "Still thinking about Saturday. Can I take you out Friday night, just us this time?" Claire had typed yes during lunch, and she had meant it. She lifted her gaze to Dan. He waited expectant, unaware that she was standing at a crossroads he couldn't see. "Dan," she said gently, "thank you, really. But I already have plans tonight." She watched the word no hit him. It wasn't visible in his posture, Dan was too controlled for that. But something in his expression flickered, a muscle tightening in his jaw, his breath a little shallow. "Oh," he said after a moment. "Of course. I understand." But he didn't. She could see he didn't. Disappointment settled in the lines around his eyes, unmistakable. Claire forced a warm professional smile. "Maybe another time." "Right," Dan said. "Another time." The words sounded stiff, almost brittle. She gathered her things shortly after and headed to the elevator, feeling his gaze on her back long after the doors closed. That evening, in her small townhouse kitchen, Claire didn't think about Dan. Not at first. She changed into something comfortable, touched up her hair, and picked out earrings that made her feel quietly pretty, not stunning, not transformed, just herself. At 7:03 p.m., Mark picked her up. He smiled as she opened the door, and something about that smile, kind, unhurried, genuinely happy to see her, steadied her in a way she needed. They went to a cozy restaurant tucked between an antique shop and a florist. Warm brick walls, flickering candles, a small jazz playlist humming in the background. Mark talked about a mural project his students were planning. Claire told him about her favorite art piece at the fundraiser. At one point, he reached for the wine bottle to refill her glass. "Is this okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. Her heart didn't pound. It settled. And that, she realized, mattered. Her smile was real. Meanwhile, across town, Dan sat alone at his desk long after most of the building had gone dark. He pretended to read a report, but nothing on the page registered. Her no echoed. Not because she rejected dinner, but because it revealed something he hadn't prepared for. She had a life outside these walls. A life that didn't include him. He rubbed a hand across his face, frustrated at how much this bothered him. When his phone buzzed, he looked down. A social media notification. Another tagged photo. He wasn't going to click. He told himself not to. But he did. The screen lit up with an image of Claire, seated at a small wooden table in a warm, softly lit restaurant. Mark leaned in, pouring wine into her glass. Claire looked up at him, with eyes that were gentle, open, almost glowing. She looked beautiful. Not because of the dress or the setting, but because she looked unguarded, happy, taken. Dan's breath caught in his chest as the truth hit him with startling force. The plans she mentioned weren't errands, weren't with Megan, weren't casual. They were with him. The man from the fundraiser, the man in the burgundy dress photo, the man whose hand had rested on her waist like it belonged there. Dan stared at the screen until the edges of the photo blurred. He had always assumed Claire was simply there, reliable, steady, orbiting quietly around his world. He never imagined someone else might become the center of hers. A thought rose heavy and undeniable. I'm losing her, and I never even had the right to try. Dan did not sleep. Not really. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the digital clock glowing relentlessly on his nightstand. Midnight passed. 1 a.m., then 2. Every time he closed his eyes, a reel of moments flickered behind his eyelids. Claire arriving early, always early, stepping quietly into the office while he barely mumbled a greeting. Claire smoothing over client tempers he'd flared without thinking. Claire hunched over files past sunset, the faint glow of her lamp the only light on the floor. And then Claire, in that burgundy dress. Claire smiling in a way he had never earned. Claire leaning toward another man whose hand rested comfortably at her waist. He felt jealousy like a physical thing lodged beneath his ribs. Not elegant, not noble, raw, ugly, too late. By dawn, he made a decision. He couldn't keep pretending it was only professional concern. He couldn't keep pretending he didn't feel what he felt. He couldn't keep watching her drift towards someone who had recognized her worth instantly the way he should have years ago. The office buzzed with its usual morning rhythm, but Dan barely heard it. He watched Claire from behind his glass wall as she sorted mail, typed rapidly, answered 2 calls at once. Efficient. Calm. Exactly the Claire she had always been, except now she was smiling softly at her phone between tasks. A small smile. Private, safe. He knew instinctively who was on the other end of those messages. Claire, he said from the doorway, his voice steady but too quiet. Can we talk in my office? She looked up surprised. Something in his tone made her straighten. Of course. When she stepped inside, he closed the door behind her. He almost never closed the door. Claire stood by the chair, but did not sit. He didn't either. Some conversations weren't meant for sitting. She waited, hands clasped lightly in front of her. Professional, neutral, guarded. Dan drew a breath. I owe you an apology. Her brows lifted a fraction, but she didn't speak. I've taken you for granted, he continued, voice rougher now. For years, I treated you as someone who handled things, fixed things, organized things. I never stopped to ask how you were doing. I never asked about your life outside these walls. Claire held his gaze expression unreadable. He swallowed. It wasn't because I didn't care, he said. It was because I didn't let myself look. And that was wrong. A small muscle near Claire's jaw tightened. I also... He paused, searching for words he'd never said aloud before. I also owe you honesty. Silence thickened. When I saw you with him, Dan said quietly, it made me jealous. Claire blinked, not in surprise, but in something sharper. Hurt, maybe. Or disbelief. Dan pushed on, unable to stop. I realized I don't want anyone else to have what I never bothered to see. I don't want, he broke off, shaking his head. This is coming out all wrong. But the truth is, I care about you, Claire. More than I should. More than I knew. And seeing you with someone else made me realize how much I don't want to lose you. The room felt still enough to hear the faint hum of HVAC vents. Claire's eyes softened for a second, just a second, with something like old ache. Then her spine straightened, and her voice came low but steady. You had 8 years. The words cut clean. 8 years, Dan, she continued. 8 years of walking past my desk. 8 years of relying on me, expecting me to make everything in your world run smooth. 8 years of not once asking who I was outside of work. Dan flinched. And now, Claire said quietly, you're jealous because someone else saw me. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Mark saw me in one evening, no title between us, no paycheck justifying the attention. He talked to me because he wanted to, not because he needed something. Dan's breath trembled as he let it out. That's not fair, he whispered. I didn't know how to. No, Claire cut in gently. What's not fair is you choosing this moment. Right when someone else recognized my worth, now you suddenly do too. He looked stunned, as if she'd struck a truth he'd never confronted. I didn't choose the timing, he said. It just hit me. I know, she replied softly. That's the problem. Pain flickered across his face. I'm not saying your feelings aren't real, she added, but I won't be the woman a man only notices once someone else picks up what he left on a shelf. He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow he knew he deserved. Claire, he murmured, I never meant to hurt you. I know, she said, but intentions don't erase patterns. Silence settled heavy between them, not tense, not angry, just heartbreakingly honest. Claire took a small step back. I need space, she said. I need to figure out what I want, not what anyone else suddenly decides I'm worth. Dan's voice cracked. Does that mean? It means, she said gently, I'm not choosing anything while emotions are this tangled. And I won't let myself be a consolation prize for anyone. She reached for the door. Claire, please. But she didn't stop. She opened the door quietly, stepped out into the hallway, and walked away with slow, steady steps. Leaving Dan alone in his office, surrounded by everything he'd built, and the one thing he was terrified he'd ruined. The Sunday afternoon sky was the color of soft honey, the kind of warm light that made even bare October trees look gentle. Claire walked along the park path near her neighborhood, the crunch of dry leaves under her boots, a steady rhythm that kept her from turning back. Mark was already there when she arrived. He stood by a wooden bench overlooking a small pond, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders relaxed. A few ducks drifted lazily across the water. Children's laughter floated from the playground in the distance. The world felt calm. Inside, Claire was anything but. Hey, Mark, said softly when he saw her. His smile was warm, but his eyes were searching. You made it. Of course, she replied. Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted it to. They fell into step together, heading down the path that curved around the pond. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just bull. Mark glanced sideways at her, then back at the path. You've been quiet these past few days. Claire let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Have I? Yeah, he said gently. You have a thinking face. I've been seeing a lot of it. She swallowed. Is that a bad thing? No. He shook his head. But it usually means you're carrying something heavy. And I keep wondering if I'm allowed to ask what it is. They walked a few more steps before she answered. You are, she said. Allowed to ask, I mean. I just didn't know how much to say. Say as much or as little as you want, Mark replied. I'm not going anywhere. The kindness in his voice almost undid her. They turned off the main path toward a quieter stretch lined with tall cottonwoods, their leaves half gold, half gone. A breeze rustled through the branches, sending a shower of yellow down around them. Claire finally spoke. There's someone, she began, her throat tightening around the words. At work. Mark didn't flinch. Didn't interrupt. Just listened. We've worked together for years, she went on. He's my boss. I've been his assistant since. Well, it feels like another lifetime now. She gave a small, shaky laugh. I used to admire him, she admitted. How driven he was. How he built this company from nothing. I respected that. But he's also complicated. He keeps everything in tight compartments. Especially people. Except you, Mark asked quietly. Claire shook her head. No. Especially me. For a long time I was just useful. Important maybe, but not seen. Not as a person. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And then, Mark prompted gently. And then she said something shifted. After the fundraiser, after that first picture with you, it's like he suddenly woke up and realized I exist outside of email and calendar invites. Mark's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. He's been kinder, she continued. More present. He listens. He asked about my weekend. He apologized for taking me for granted. And the other day She hesitated, heart beating faster. He told me he was jealous. When he saw me with you. The words hung in the cool afternoon air. Mark was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps and the distant bark of a dog. Jealous, he repeated at last. Claire nodded, eyes fixed on the path. He said he doesn't want anyone else to have what he never bothered to see, she said, voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know what to do with that. They reached a small bridge over a narrow stream and stopped, leaning against the wooden railing. The water below moved slowly, carrying fallen leaves along with it. Mark stared at the water for a moment, then looked up at the sky. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. Claire, he said, can I ask you something honestly? Yes. When you're with him, Mark asked, do you feel more alive, even when it hurts? She closed her eyes. She didn't want to answer, but he deserved the truth. Yes, she said finally. And when you're with me, he continued gently. How do you feel? She looked at him then. Really looked. Safe, she said. Steady. Seen. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. And your heart? He asked quietly. Where is it? She felt tears prick behind her eyes. Still figuring it out, she whispered. But if I'm honest, it's not where it should be for you. Not fully. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that's not fair to you. He was silent. The wind picked up, scattering a few more leaves across the path. Claire blinked quickly, a tear slipping free despite her efforts. I didn't plan this, she said, voice unsteady. I didn't ask for him to wake up now after all these years. I didn't ask to feel anything at all, to be honest. I was fine. Numb maybe, but fine. She swallowed hard. You've been good to me, Mark. Kind. Easy to be with. And I tried to move forward, to let myself want that. Want you. He smiled faintly, sadly. But part of me, she said, hand pressed against her chest, is still standing in an office with a glass wall waiting for a man who never looked up. And now that he finally has, I don't know how to step fully toward you without lying to both of us. A long silence followed. Mark's gaze drifted back to the water. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on words before deciding whether to spit them out or swallow them whole. Claire, he said, at last I knew. Her breath caught. You. What? He gave a small, wry smile. I knew there was somebody you hadn't let go of yet. I could hear it in the way you talked around certain parts of your life, in the way your eyes would drift when I asked about work. She stared at him, stunned. I was hoping, he continued gently, selfishly, that time would change it. That maybe if I just showed up enough, was kind enough, patient enough, your heart might decide it was tired of waiting for someone else. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. But you don't owe me a half heart, Mark said softly. No matter how much I might want more, I don't want it like that. The tenderness in his voice made her chest ache. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. You deserve someone who looks at you the way I look at him, and I hate that I can't be that person right now. Maybe ever. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her hand where it rested on the railing. Don't hate it, he said. Just accept it. It's the truth. And I'd rather have the truth than a version of you constantly trying to force yourself into something you're not ready for. Her tears came freely, then not loud, not dramatic, just quiet streams etching lines down her cheeks. Thank you, she managed. For seeing me, for never trying to own me. Some people, he said, You're just grateful to have met. Even if they don't end up staying the way you hoped. They stood there for another moment, hands touching lightly, two adults who understood that love wasn't always about getting what you wanted. Sometimes it was about letting go before you broke something fragile. They walked back to the park entrance in silence, side by side, the distance between them now full of things said and unsaid. At the gate, Mark turned to her. "Friends?" he asked, offering a small, tentative smile. Claire nodded through her tears. "If you still want that." "I do," he said. "Maybe not right away. But eventually, you're worth having in my life. Even if it's not the way I imagined." She let out a breath that felt like release and grief all at once. As she watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller along the path, Claire realized this was the first fully honest choice she'd made for her own heart in years. And honesty, even when it hurt, felt strangely like hope. Monday morning arrived gray and wind-strewn, the kind of Colorado morning that hinted at snow even when the forecast refused to commit. Claire pulled into the parking garage with a hollow ache in her chest, not because she regretted anything she'd said to Dan or anything she'd admitted to Mark, but because honesty often came with a kind of quiet grief. Still, she walked into the office with clarity she hadn't felt in years. Today, she told herself she would simply work. No reading between lines, no lingering looks, no emotional knots, just work. An envelope sat on her keyboard, plain cream paper, no company logo, no embossed lettering, just her name, Claire. Written in Dan's unmistakably sharp handwriting, softened only by the way the ink curved slightly at the edges. Her first instinct was tension tightening in her shoulders. She scanned the room. No one was watching her. The office hummed with its usual Monday rhythms, printers whirring, keyboards tapping, muffled greetings floating from cubicles. Only then did she sit down and open the envelope. The letter inside was written in dark blue ink. No typed lines, no bullet points, no signature block. Just his words. "Claire, I've spent most of my life building things, systems, solutions, a company that runs with precision. But I didn't realize until recently that I built all of it by keeping people at arm's length. It was easier to manage a system than to care about the people inside it. Easier to set high standards than to admit I didn't know how to connect. You were the one who held everything together. And I treated you like a function, not a person. That is my failure, not yours. I'm not writing to ask anything from you, not forgiveness, not understanding, and certainly not a relationship you're not ready for. I'm writing because you deserve, at minimum, the respect of a man willing to admit he's been wrong for a very long time. I've started making changes, small, but real ones, delegating instead of assuming you will absorb the overflow, learning the names of new staff instead of letting you handle their orientation alone, meeting with HR to revise policies that should have been updated years ago, really trying to understand the people I work with, not just the work they produce. These are not gifts, they're obligations I failed to meet long before now, and you owe me nothing in return. If you choose to never let me closer than a professional distance, I will understand. But I want you to know something clearly. I will still spend whatever's left of my life becoming a man worthy of the respect you gave me for free." Dan. Claire read the letter once. Then again, and again, slower this time. By the third reading, her vision blurred. Not from heartbreak that had already happened over the last 8 years in small, invisible ways. No, these tears came from something different. This wasn't a grand gesture aimed at winning her. This wasn't possessiveness or competition or impulse. This was accountability. Quiet, mature, unpolished, but sincere. A kind of apology you only wrote once in your life when you finally realized who you were and who you should have been. She pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, letting the stillness of the morning settle around her. Because for the first time, Dan wasn't asking. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't assuming. He was simply admitting he was human. A deeply flawed man trying to grow. And that moved her more than any romantic declaration could have. She wiped her eyes just as someone walked past, and she quickly slipped the letter back into its envelope. She didn't need questions or whispers. She didn't need anyone interpreting something that wasn't yet anything. But before she could fully tuck the envelope into her drawer, some instinct made her look up. Dan stood across the office floor. Not staring. Not approaching. not expecting. He was simply there, hands in his pockets, posture uncertain, in a way she had never seen, offering her a small, cautious nod. Not an invitation, not a plea, just acknowledgement. Your move, but also only if you want to. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. For 8 years he had walked past her without seeing her. Today he didn't move until he knew she'd seen him too. Something in the air felt different, not like sparks or romance or the dramatic swell of possibility, more like the first breath after a long winter. Fragile, unhurried, real. She placed the letter gently in her drawer, closed it, and sat still for a moment, palms pressed flat against the edge of her desk. Whatever happened next, whatever form this story would take, this was the first time Dan had given her something without taking anything in return. And that, Claire realized, might be the beginning of a new kind of courage for both of them. The air carried a faint bite that Thursday evening, the kind of early winter chill Denver was famous for, light enough to lace your breath with silver yet gentle enough to make the world feel alive. Claire walked the narrow path up the hill toward the small overlook park, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her heart beating in a slow, measured rhythm. She had been the one to ask him, "Can we talk outside the office?" His reply had come almost instantly, "Tell me when and where." She'd chosen this park deliberately quiet, unpretentious, a single wooden bench perched at the top of a grassy rise with a panoramic view of downtown. The sun had dipped below the Rockies, leaving streaks of lavender and apricot across the sky. The first city lights flickered on like shy stars. Dan was already there. He stood with his back to her, hands in his coat pockets, looking out over the skyline as though he were searching for something he'd misplaced years ago. When he turned at the sound of her steps, his expression softened in a way that made her pulse stutter. "Hi," she said, breathless though she'd walked slowly. "Hi," he echoed, but gently, not the clipped tone she'd heard. For 8 years, there was room in that single word. They sat on the bench, leaving a respectful, careful space between them. A few lights blinked on in office floors miles away, like reminders of the life they'd stepped out of, at least for tonight. Claire exhaled first. "Thank you for meeting me." "Thank you for asking," he replied, and he meant it. He looked almost relieved, like he'd been waiting all week for a sign that the letter hadn't pushed her farther away. She reached into her bag, touching the worn edge of the envelope inside, not to pull it out, but as reassurance. "I read your letter," she began softly. "More than once." Dan nodded, eyes steady on her. "And," he asked. She looked down at her hands, fingers interlaced together for warmth. "It moved me," she admitted. "Not because it was poetic or dramatic, it wasn't." She looked up, meeting his eyes fully, but because it felt honest, not the kind of honesty that wants something back, just the kind that tells the truth. A quiet breath escaped him, part relief, part vulnerability. "I wasn't trying to ask anything of you," he said. "I just needed you to know I see the damage I caused, and the things I should have seen sooner." "I know," she whispered. "And I've noticed the changes." He blinked. "You have," she nodded. "You helped Jenna from accounting instead of forwarding her to me. You spent an entire afternoon with HR rewriting the overtime policy. You even learned everyone's names on the 3rd floor." He let out a soft, embarrassed laugh. It seemed overdue. "It was," she said, but not unkindly. Silence settled again, but this one felt gentler, like a blanket instead of a wall. Claire drew a slow breath. "I ended things with Mark," she said quietly. Dan's reaction was barely visible, just a tightening near his mouth, a shift in posture, but she felt something ripple through him. "He's a good man," she continued, "and he deserved someone whose heart wasn't divided, someone who wasn't standing halfway in a place she'd been trying to pretend didn't matter anymore." Dan's voice was barely audible. "Claire." She held up a hand, firm but gentle. "Let me finish." He nodded. She turned slightly toward him, the fading light catching in her eyes. "Dan, I care about you," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of truth. "More than I probably should. More than I want to sometimes, but I can't do almost." The word fell heavily between them. "I can't," she repeated, softer. "If this is jealousy talking or curiosity because someone else noticed me first. If this is guilt or loneliness or a midlife panic where you suddenly realize you're human? I need to know now. He swallowed throat tight, because Claire continued, if I let myself fall into this, I won't be casual about it. I won't be someone you test a theory on. If this ends badly, it won't be a small bruise for me. It will break something that took years to rebuild. For once in his life, he let silence breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded. I'm sure, he said. Claire searched his face, looking for hesitation or doubt. There was none. His gaze held hers with a quiet conviction she had never seen from him, not in board meetings, not during crises, not even in moments of triumph. I don't know how to be perfect at this, he admitted. I've spent so long building a life where emotions were optional. Efficiency came first. You know that better than anyone. She almost smiled at that, almost. But he continued, I know I don't want a life where you're just my assistant. I don't want a world where I only see you from across a desk. I want... He paused, searching for the simplest form of truth. I want a life where you're my partner. In whatever form you'd allow that to be. The words were not flowery, not grand, not dramatic, but they were solid, like stone set in place. Claire felt her chest tighten, not painfully, but as if something fragile and dormant inside her had finally unfolded its wings. She looked down at her hands. Then slowly she reached out, her fingers brushed against his first tentative questioning. Dan didn't move, didn't assume, didn't take. He simply opened his hand, offering space, and she slid her fingers into his, lacing them together. A small gesture, but in their world it felt like the hinge moment of an entire life. They sat in silence, shoulders almost touching the city, stretching out below them like a constellation of new beginnings. The evening deepened around them, not cold, not empty, but full of a quiet, cautious hope. Claire squeezed his hand first. Dan squeezed back, and for the first time, neither looked away. The first whisper reached Claire on Tuesday morning. She had just stepped out of the elevator when she caught her name, soft, sharp, and wrapped in a tone she hadn't heard in years. She didn't catch the whole sentence, just fragments. Well, that explains date. The boss raise came out of nowhere. Her steps faltered for half a second. She forced herself to keep walking. By the time she reached her desk, her pulse was fluttering, thin and uneven. She set her bag down with hands that felt suddenly foreign. When you've spent years being invisible, attention, especially the wrong kind, can feel like stepping into blinding light. Every stare felt like a pin pressed against her skin. She tried to breathe, tried to focus, but every time she moved through the hallway, the whispers rose again like a draft under a closed door. Did you hear? She must be. Well, that's how she climbed. No one said anything directly to her. Of course they didn't. They didn't have to. By noon, the shame she thought she'd buried with her divorce was rising again, that familiar ache of being judged without a chance to speak. She told herself she was overreacting, that it didn't matter what others thought. But it did. It mattered more than she wanted to admit. During lunch, she sat alone in a small conference room, pretending to read through shipment reports. Her hands trembled slightly when she turned the pages. A quiet knock sounded. Claire Dan stood in the doorway, concern etched deep into his face. He didn't step inside, didn't push the boundary, he just waited, giving her room to decide. She lifted her gaze. Something you need. You've been quiet today, he said gently. Quieter than usual. She hesitated, then finally answered, people are talking. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. He closed the door behind him and sat across the table, posture, steady eyes fixed on her with an honesty she wasn't used to seeing from him. What are they saying? He asked. She gave a small, brittle laugh. That I'm sleeping my way into promotions. That I finally figured out how to get your attention. This, she gestured vaguely between them, explains everything. Dan's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking once. You don't deserve that, he said. It doesn't matter what I deserve, she murmured. People will believe what they want to believe. It matters to me, he said firmly. She looked down at her hands. I've worked here for 8 years. I've given everything I had to make this place run. And now it feels like all of that is being reduced to a rumor someone tossed into the air. A moment passed quiet but charged. Then Dan spoke with a clarity she recognized from board meetings, except softer, more personal. "I won't let them diminish what you've built here." "Dan, I won't," he repeated. "And I'm done letting the culture of this place run on autopilot. I created the structure that allowed this kind of whispering. That's on me, so I'm fixing it." And because he never wasted time between decision and action, he moved immediately. That afternoon, he met with HR. Claire didn't hear the whole discussion, but she saw people emerge with serious expressions, clipboards clutched tight, and an urgency that suggested the CEO had lit a fire under long-standing policies. By evening, a memo went out company-wide. Effective immediately, Claire Winslow will transition out of the executive assistant role and into director of operations. She will no longer report directly to the CEO. Responsibilities formalized. Oversight structure updated. Performance metrics transparent and reviewed quarterly by an independent committee. Claire read the announcement twice. Director of Operations. A role she had essentially been performing in pieces for years, but now official. With boundaries, with clarity, with respect. The promotion wasn't a favor. It wasn't a perk. It was overdue. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. 2 days later, Dan called an all-staff meeting. The conference room filled quickly, nearly 100 people murmuring, shifting, glancing at Claire with curiosity, suspicion, or something in between. She stood near the back, heart-pounding hands clasped behind her. Dan stepped to the front. He didn't use the podium. He stood plain and visible, no barrier between him and the room. "I'm aware," he began, his voice carrying without effort, "that there have been rumors about changes in this company." A ripple moved through the room. "I want to address them directly," he said. "No whispers, no assumptions. Just facts." He paused long enough for the quiet to deepen. Claire Winslow has been the backbone of Thornton Logistics for nearly a decade. She has run operations, handled crises, supported every department, and kept this company on its feet more times than most of you will ever know. People shifted uncomfortable because they did know. Many had relied on her themselves. "If she is advancing," Dan continued, "it is not because of her relationship with me. It's because she has been doing the work of a senior leader for years, without the title, without the pay, and without the recognition I should have given her long ago." Claire felt her breath catch. "Inappropriate gossip stops today," he said, voice low but unmistakably firm. "If anyone has questions, concerns, or doubts, my door is open. You bring them to me, not to the hallway, not to each other." A stunned quiet fell. He stepped back slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "That's all." The meeting dissolved into murmurs, but they were different, now unsure, thoughtful, chastened. No one approached her immediately, no one whispered. But as she gathered her notebook and headed toward the door, someone stepped into her path. A man in his 60s, gray hair, kind eyes, a shipping supervisor who had been with the company longer than anyone. He offered her a small, sincere nod. "For what it's worth, Claire," he said quietly, "most of us know you've been holding this place together for years." Her throat tightened so suddenly she could barely speak. "Thank you," she finally whispered. He squeezed her shoulder once before walking away. Claire stood there, blinking back the sting in her eyes, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Dignity returning. Piece by piece, word by spoken word. And far across the room she saw Dan watching her, not proudly, not possessively, just relieved. As if he'd finally done one thing right. A year later the world felt different, not louder, not brighter, but more settled, as if someone had finally tuned the static out of Claire's life. She and Dan lived now in a modest but warm house just outside Denver, a place with creaky wooden floors and a backyard full of sunlight. From their porch, the Rockies rose in the distance like a quiet promise, their peaks catching the morning light long before the rest of the city woke. Claire wrapped her hands around a warm mug, steam curling against the chilly spring air. Dan stood beside her, leaning on the railing, hair still rumpled from sleep. They drank coffee together most mornings, not in a rush, not trading schedules, not planning crises, just being. "It's a pretty good view," Dan murmured, nodding toward the mountains. Claire smiled. "You say that every morning." Because it's true, every morning. She nudged his elbow playfully, and he nudged her back gentle as a tide. There had been a time when both of them rose before dawn, she to prepare his world, he to conquer his. Now, they still worked hard, still carried responsibility, but the frantic edge that once defined their days had softened. The company had changed too. Processes that used to rely on Claire's silent labor were now transparent, shared, structured. Teams collaborated more. People stayed later because they wanted to, not because they were afraid not to. HR was no longer just a department, it was a voice in the room. And Claire, as director of operations, shaped as much of the company's daily rhythm as Dan did its long-term strategy. Sometimes she caught employees glancing at her with something new in their expression, not deference, not suspicion. Respect. She wasn't invisible anymore. That afternoon, after a long day of vendor calls and process reviews, Claire walked past the upstairs hallway on her way to change clothes. Something on the wall caught her eye, and she paused. Dan had hung one of her old paintings, a landscape she'd painted more than 10 years ago when life was harder, but her heart still carried color. It was a stormy canvas full of movement and emotion she hadn't let herself feel openly. She'd almost thrown it away once. Dan had insisted on keeping it. Why this one, she asked him then, and again now as he walked up the hall toward her. He stopped beside her, following her gaze. Because he said softly, "You spent so long hiding your colors from everyone, including yourself." He touched the corner of the frame lightly. "I want to see them. Every day." The words warmed her in places she didn't know still needed warmth. That evening they returned to the same art center where she had first met Mark, where everything had begun in a way Claire never could have predicted. The fundraiser was livelier this year. Golden lights strung across the courtyard, soft jazz drifting from an open doorway, people chatting and mingling with glasses of wine. Claire wore a dark green dress, this time simple but elegant. She no longer dressed to disappear. Dan beside her rested a steady hand on her lower back, not possessive but present. A volunteer recognized them from last year and grinned. "Let me take a picture of you two. You look great together." Dan started to decline. He still wasn't completely comfortable with candid attention, but Claire nodded. "Sure," she said. They stepped closer. Dan slid his arm around her waist, and Claire leaned gently into him. The camera clicked, capturing something the two of them felt but rarely saw from the outside. When the volunteer showed them the photo on her phone, Claire felt the breath catch in her chest. This time the woman in the picture wasn't invisible, wasn't uncertain, wasn't waiting for someone to notice her. This time she was standing next to a man who looked at her as though she was the quiet center of a world he finally understood. Dan's smile in the photo wasn't polished or practiced. It was soft, real, a man quietly grateful for the second chance he'd nearly lost. The volunteer walked away, leaving them with a moment suspended between past and present. Claire touched her fingers lightly to Dan's arm. "You okay?" He turned to her, eyes gentle. "More than okay." They stayed at the fundraiser longer than they expected, talking with artists, bidding on a small watercolor that reminded her of her mother's garden, sharing a plate of roasted figs and goat cheese. Nothing dramatic happened. No confessions, no crises, just life lived together. On the drive home, the city glowed like embers behind them. They stopped at a red light near the edge of downtown, the hum of the engine blending with a faint night breeze through the open window. Claire leaned her head against Dan's shoulder, a simple gesture that still felt sacred. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, glancing at her gently. "For seeing me?" His hand slid from the steering wheel to rest over her fingers, curling with quiet certainty. "I wasn't really living," he said, voice low and honest, "until I did." The light turned green, but for a moment Dan didn't move. He just stayed there holding her hand, letting the truth settle between them like the steady glow of the streetlights. Claire closed her eyes, feeling not the ache of being unseen, not the anxiety of wondering if she mattered, but the peace of a life built from mutual recognition. A life where her colors weren't hidden. A life where she didn't vanish in the background. A life where someone finally looked up and kept looking. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it. In the quiet spaces between who we were and who we're becoming. Claire's story reminds us that being unseen can leave a long, invisible bruise on the heart. We learn to shrink ourselves, to stay useful, to take up less space than we deserve. And yet life has a way of placing the right mirror in front of us. A moment, a person, a truth that gently says, you were never meant to disappear. And Dan's journey shows something just as human. Sometimes we don't realize what matters until silence or jealousy or loss shakes us awake. Growth may not erase the past, but sincere effort can build a different future. Maybe the lesson is simple. We all want to be seen not for what we do, but for who we are when the world stops watching. And when someone finally looks at us with understanding, it can change everything. Thank you for spending this time with us. For letting this story sit with you, breathe with you, and maybe touch a quiet corner of your own heart. These stories exist because of you, the people who still believe in kindness and second chances, in the beauty of seeing one another fully. If Claire's journey meant something to you, even just a little, we invite you to help us keep this light alive. Every like, every share, every subscribe is not just support for the channel, it's a way to spread more stories that heal, soften, and remind us what truly matters. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul.